as well. So this is a partnership for our session on reclaiming the narrative between the Arizona Department of Education Academic Standards Unit and the Office of Indian Education Unit, along with the Native Americans Administration and the Phoenix Indian Boarding School Visitor Center. So with that, we're going to go into our land acknowledgements, and I'll turn it over to Helen.
Yeah, thank you. So we are going to introduce ourselves in just a moment, although if you attended part 1 or watched the recording, you should already be familiar with us both. But we do want to, again, ask for you to engage in a quick land acknowledgement when you introduce yourselves in the chat. So just putting up on the screen the QR code that you can use. Linda just dropped the link in the chat. In our last session, we showed you a video from the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture that really showcased a variety of Native perspectives around why land acknowledgements are important or meaningful. And we're not going to show that video again, but we did want to drop the link to that webpage so that if you wanted to review it or share it with anybody, you have the link. And so with that, we will introduce ourselves. And so, Pete Washte, Helen Wape, Thomas Imachape Casto, Malakota Casto, Chante Washte Nape Chizapi. So hello again, everybody. My name is Helen Thomas. I am the Office of Indian Education's Professional Learning Coordinator. I am Hunkpapa Lakota, and I included, as always, in my introduction, I greet you with good feelings in my heart. I'm really grateful to be here with you all today. And not going to share my whole background because you probably heard that in part 1, and I will pass it over to Linda.
Thank you. So welcome everybody. My name is Linda Burrows and I am the Director for K-12 Social Studies and World and Native Languages here at the Department of Education. And prior to that, I taught public school for over 20 years. And I'm going to go ahead and do our land acknowledgement, and then I'll turn it over to Melita Yazi to introduce herself. So I would like to just acknowledge that the Arizona Department of Education is located on the ancestral homelands of the Akimal Otham and Peepash peoples. We recognize that the Akimal Otham and Peepash peoples as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And we also acknowledge that without their knowledge and contributions, we would not be able to survive on these lands as guests today. We would also like to acknowledge that the Phoenix metropolitan area is actually home to one of the largest urban Native populations in the United States. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Melita to introduce herself.
Sheya Melita Yazian Shia Nakaid Nashli do ki ani bashichin do Islanda Eda Shiche do an Toike Plini Dasha Nada Otago Eden Estanshla. Ayisina Shaniki and they say bit for Horgedo Adashiaho Kutago the Estanshla. Hi everybody, my name is Melita Yazi. I introduced myself in Navajo, my 4 clans. And I also talked about where I was born and where I was raised. And this is how I am a Navajo or a Diné woman. I am the director at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center. And my job is to administrate the Administration for Native Americans grant from the federal government. So that's kind of what I do, and I'm working with the Department of Education to deliver these services, and I'm very, very happy, and this is very, very important work that we're doing here. Thank you.
Thank you, Melita. We do want to encourage everyone in the space to quickly introduce themselves. So if you could share your name, your role, your organization, and again, the tribal nation closest to you or on whose ancestral homelands you live and or work. And then we do want to also acknowledge our other community partner, Professor Manny Pino, who is a professor in American Indian Studies, has spent decades research and teaching about topics like this. And he really did a wonderful job of providing us with some really great context around the history of the policies around federal Indian boarding schools. And while he's not joining us today, his contact information will also be included at the end. And he was very open and willing to answer any questions that anybody has. Really grateful for everyone who's in the space. I know we're a bit of a smaller group today, but we're very thankful that you're willing to spend some time with us today and really get into how we can start bringing this topic into our classrooms. So please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. Thank you so much to those who already dropped their introductions in. But we are going to move on just to reviewing our community agreements. These are the same community agreements from part 1 of our session. The first being that we're all here to learn. The second agreement being that everyone brings valuable knowledge and experiences into this space. Third, that please take care of yourself and others. And then of course, please expect and accept non-closure as we only have a limited amount of time together today. And we really do want to call back to that third agreement of take care of yourself and others. We know that this is a heavy topic and that for many of us who are Indigenous educators in the space, we likely have personal connections to this topic. I know I do. And so if you do need to step away or take care of yourself, please do so. And we're happy to meet your needs. And if you notice someone has stepped away and they have a question or they need a little bit of information when you're in a breakout room or on what you're doing, please don't hesitate to help each other out and take care of others as well. And so with that, I'm going to give the mic over to Linda again to tell you all what we're going to be doing today.
Thank you. So we have a couple of things that we'd like to go over with you in our short time today. We've completed our welcome and introductions, but now we're going to spend some time reviewing culturally responsive and trauma-informed teaching and what that means in our classrooms. We're going to explore resources that directly result or access the idea of teaching about the Native American boarding schools. And we're also going to examine how Native American boarding schools fit into our social studies standards. And then lastly, we'll have some time to kind of process and go through this with some closing reflections for you. We do have a few learning outcomes for you to kind of focus on as we're going through our learning today. And so the first is that we will, again, explore those and adapted trauma-informed and culturally responsive guidelines, specifically for the K-2 classroom, right? We recognize that obviously the content area may not be what you are going to be teaching, but that you may be dealing with students that come from or have had trauma from families that have been a part of Native American boarding schools, as well as just some of the general issues of social emotional learning that we'll be looking at. Demonstrating those understandings for what's developmentally appropriate, as well as identifying opportunities where we can fit some of those standards or ideas into our already existing curriculum. We're not asking you to revamp and redo, large swaths of your curriculum, but where you can put those voices in and those ideas and get that in there. And then we last want to give you some brainstorming time to really process the topic. And then also we want you to feel confident. But again, what Helen noted earlier that, we only have a small, short amount of time together. So, there may be work for us going forward too.
All right, so the Office of Indian Education is specifically very committed to providing professional learning opportunities that promote culturally responsive and culturally responsive trauma-informed practices and approaches. But we know that this can be somewhat of a buzzword, it's gaining popularity. And so it's really important for us to know what you already know or are wondering about this topic. So we're asking, what do you already know about culturally responsive or trauma-informed teaching just broadly? And then what questions do you have regarding teaching about Native American boarding schools in this way specifically? So we've dropped a link to a Mentimeter in the chat. And just as a reminder, a Mentimeter is just a completely anonymous way to gather some responses from you all, but we want to make sure we're being responsive to where you're at in your journey with this topic. It's important to us that you feel like your needs are being met and that you're given the supports that you need in order to genuinely bring some of these topics into your classroom. And so we'll take just a minute or two to fill out some responses in the Mentimeter, and then I can pull them up once those responses come in. Okay, so we already have some great responses. And you can submit more than once if you want to submit one response for your kind of what you already know, and then another one if you have some specific questions, that's totally fine. But I'm going to share these two responses already up here because I think they're short, but they really get at a good point, especially this one around there being a lot of reflection involved. And I'm really happy that that's something that's resonating with some people because we intentionally designed these sessions to hold space for that reflection and to really process some of this information because we know we don't usually get a lot of other opportunities to talk about this topic in other teacher education spaces. So appreciate those that are saying they're open to learning. I also want to note that if you're calling in from a phone or if you don't have, if it's not easy for you to access the Mentimeter link from whatever device that you're on, you can always share your responses in the chat, and that's perfectly appropriate as well. So I think we'll just take another few seconds. I'm curious, as people are typing out their responses, if anyone's had any professional learning already in culturally responsive or trauma-informed teaching. I know with the pandemic, trauma-informed teaching has become a little more popular and is gaining more attention. But I definitely think the lens that we're bringing to that, right, of thinking about historical trauma, all the things we learned in part one, is a little bit different than what you see most schools focusing on.
I think most schools use that CASELS framework, the CASELS as a framework for culturally responsive, or, for social and emotional teaching. So this will hit on a lot of those ideas, but then we take it a step further and bring in that culturally responsive portion to it.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you to everyone that shared. I know I'm sure more responses will come in. And if you have questions that come up as we're sharing, as we're speaking, you can always drop them in the chat or add them to that same link and we will see them there as well.
All right, so we're going to transition now into our culturally responsive and trauma-informed guidance. So Helen's going to give you a really nice, solid overview of how the Office of Indian Education with the Department of Ed defines culturally responsive teaching and what that means and looks like. And then we're also going to look at another guideline from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and what their trauma-informed guidance is as well.
Yeah, so I often like to start with this quote when talking about culturally responsive approaches. And this quote comes from Zaretta Hammond, who's an educator turned author and wrote the book Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain in 2015. But the quote says, "One's culture is a part of how the brain makes sense of the world and helps us function in our environment." And so I like to start with this quote not only because it shows how culturally responsive approaches are backed by neuroscience, but also I think it speaks to the fact that all of our students, regardless of their background, not just our Native students, not just our students of color, are bringing a cultural frame of reference into the classroom with them. And so if we can keep that in mind and even think about our own cultural frame of reference, I think it helps us understand how being culturally responsive is a really meaningful practice. And so the Office of Indian Education has a working definition for culturally responsive education or teaching and learning. And that is that culturally responsive teaching and learning is informed by and or intentionally integrates cultural strengths in order to master Arizona state standards. And this is, again, a working definition, which means that it may be changed or expanded upon depending on the work that we do in the future, because we've just really begun this work in the Office of Indian Education. But when we say cultural strengths, you may have heard other terms that could describe those cultural strengths, like funds of knowledge or community cultural wealth within a lot of Native communities, specific ways of knowing and being. But really all these are the routines, the communication styles, the information processing strategies that our students already bring with them into the classroom, right? And those are not just individual strengths, but often community-based strengths as well. And so when we're thinking about culturally responsive teaching and learning, I want to start by saying it's really important to think of both our content choices in the classroom, but also our process choices, our instructional choices, because culture does not just influence what our students know, what kinds of things they know about when they come into the classroom, but also how they know certain things. And so when we're talking about culturally responsive approaches today, I want you all to really consider how this impacts not only what we're using in the classroom, but how we're using those resources and how you're setting up your lessons to promote culturally responsive processes in your classroom as well. We also want to take a moment to provide a note on some language, which is that the Arizona Office of Indian Education is currently moving towards using the phrase culturally sustaining and revitalizing education. And the reason why is that we want to be very intentional with the language we use and note that we're not just advocating for educators to recognize that their students have a unique culture, and not only just be responsive to that culture, but really give students the opportunity to sustain that culture so that both home and mainstream cultural knowledge and ways of being are being valued and maintained and nurtured in the classroom. And when we think back to what we learned in part 1 of this series about how our Native students' cultures and languages and really all those cultural strengths they brought with into school were intentionally disrupted and removed and stripped away. That's where this language of revitalizing comes from. Just including the word revitalizing acknowledges that a lot of Native languages and cultural practices are being revived right now as a result of them being damaged over time. Okay, so we want to be very mindful about what we're promoting, and that really is culturally sustaining and revitalizing practices. So if you attend future professional learning, you may hear us not necessarily say culturally responsive, but culturally sustaining and revitalizing. And some of the work we're doing right now is just looking at how from culturally relevant pedagogy all the way to culturally sustaining and revitalizing, there's a similar goal and motivations there. It's just about being very intentional with your language, right? And so I feel the idea of being culturally sustaining or revitalizing can be a little overwhelming, right? Especially when we're teaching students that are not from the same cultures as our own. And so a helpful way to think about culturally sustaining education is to reflect on what aspects of our students' cultures are we considering and or integrating into our curriculum and instruction. And so it can be helpful to think of the 3 levels of culture as a tree. Mean the leaves represent kind of the surface level of culture, and those are the observable features, while the trunk represents what is known as the shallow aspects of culture. And these are not as obvious, but can still be discerned through careful observation and inquiry. And these are things like unspoken norms and protocols for engaging with each other. But really the deepest level of culture is the foundation, and that's represented by the roots of the tree, right? And these are the collective beliefs and the values that are often only identifiable by those who are active participants within that culture, right? And so those are the types of things that you could read about them, you could find information about them, but in order to really understand them and process that information, often that comes through participating in those ways of being. And so I want to note, sometimes people use the analogy of an iceberg for culture, and I've heard that many times, and that's an analogy I used to use. But I definitely really prefer to use the analogy of a tree because I think it embodies the dynamic and the changing nature of culture, right? A tree changes based on the environment, based on the time of year. And so that kind of, I think, is more encompassing of culture, which it's really important for us to understand that it's not static, very dynamic, and that even within one community, demonstrations of culture are going to look different based on those individual people, based on things like their age. I know we've had a lot of conversations recently in the office around kind of youth culture, right? And the difference with even intergenerationally, like the way that I demonstrate my Lakota culture, different than the way my grandmother did. And then my younger nieces and nephews, that looks really different as well. And they're engaging with kind of our Lakota culture in a different way, and that's okay. But the analogy of a tree, again, I got that from Zaretta Hammond's book. And in that book, she notes that a lot of historical integrations of culture into schooling have mostly engaged with students' cultures just at the surface level, right? Just those observable level, like the holidays they celebrate or the foods they eat or the clothing they wear. And while these are really important and students need to see themselves represented in the classroom that way, neuroscience actually tells us that integrating deeper levels of culture has a higher cognitive impact on students' learning because it has a more emotional reaction, getting at their amygdala, but then also tapping into some of their long-term memories and things like that. So we definitely want to encourage educators to think about how they can tap into those deep levels of culture. And so this is not to say that you need to be to be a culturally sustaining practitioner, that you have to be an expert in your students' culture. And again, if you are someone that has a differing cultural background than your students, it might not be appropriate for you to try and attempt to be an expert in their culture, right? And so in fact, a sense of cultural humility is often necessary to recognize that as educators, we need to take the time to learn with our students, but also from students, their families, and the communities we serve, if we really want to respectfully integrate their cultural strengths into our classrooms. And so this starts with reflecting on our own cultural background and considering how it influences our choices as educators. And then when we model this sense of cultural humility, we're teaching our students, right, that the importance of cultural competency, and that building cultural competency not only with your own identity and your own cultural identity, but also with others, is a lifelong skill and a journey that doesn't necessarily have an end, but something that is going to be valuable for them, regardless of where they're at, who they're with, and what they're working on. And so again, I want to highlight that you do not need to be a cultural expert to be culturally responsive or sustaining. And that it can be overwhelming when you teach in a very diverse classroom to think about, like, how am I responsive, or how do I help sustain all of these various cultures that are represented in my classroom? And so a lot of scholars have pointed out that there are characteristics or archetypes that can be found across many communities that kind of encompass or get at those shallow and deep levels of their cultures in ways where they differ from the mainstream culture, right? But they just resonate more with some of our students. So for example, many of our Native communities and cultures, right, have oral traditions. And this is not to say that Native students don't come into school with strong written skills as well, but just that a lot of Native students bring information processing skills that leverage oral and speaking and listening skills, which can then help them master some other aspects of literacy, right? Additionally, most Native communities and other cultures with kind of global Indigenous roots, like African American communities, Pacific Islander communities, Latino communities, tend to have a more collectivist orientation than an individualistic orientation, whereas a lot of our mainstream culture is very individualistic, right? And so when we encourage collaborative and interdependent learning, this creates school environments that better align with the cultural strengths that these kinds of students bring into the classroom. And so when we're thinking about how does this connect to our topic for today, teaching about Native American boarding schools, I just encourage you to note how some of the resources and the recommendations we share, whether they're kind of on the spectrum of oral traditions to written traditions, bringing in a more balanced approach and having both incorporated into the classroom, and the same thing with collectivist and kind of individualistic. And so one last way that we can start to better understand our Indigenous students and Indigenous peoples here in Arizona, their shallow and deeper levels of culture, is by learning about and affirming Indigenous knowledge systems in our instruction. So particularly when we're teaching Indigenous perspectives like we are today, right? So the Arizona Office of Indian Education believes that Indigenous knowledge systems are really going to help us get at that deeper level of culture. And so if you're not familiar, Indigenous knowledge systems is a phrase that comes from higher education, from American Indian Studies, and it's really encompassing the ways that Indigenous peoples make sense of the world around them, how they share knowledge, what kind of knowledge is valued, how knowledge is demonstrated in their own unique ways, right? And so the reason why it's plural and it says Indigenous knowledge systems is because often Indigenous nations and communities have knowledge that is very much place-based. It's related to the place that they're in, long-standing relationships with the place that they live. And it's also rooted in community and kinship. So oral traditions are an aspect, right, of Indigenous knowledge systems. And because oral traditions happen most often through storytelling, right, there's a relationship often between the person telling the story and the people listening to the story that's grounded in kinship. And you see a lot of the traits of Indigenous knowledge systems, which you see up on the screen, are most of the time demonstrated in traditional Indigenous education approaches. But what's really exciting now is that a lot of Indigenous educators and scholars are writing and researching around how we can bring these ways of knowing and being into our contemporary context to provide just a more balanced, contextualized, and interconnected way of learning that's going to resonate for our Native students. And then also, again, just bring a different way of learning and being into the classroom. And so that specific recommendation brings me to some other broad recommendations that we've used in a separate professional learning series we offered this summer that was just broadly about teaching Indigenous perspectives in social studies. And this comes from the National Council for the Social Studies. It's a 2019 position statement that was authored by Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators about what social studies education that respects and affirms Indigenous peoples and nations looks like. And so there's 7 recommendations here, and I bolded the fact that affirming Indigenous knowledges was one of their recommendations. And so we hope that through some of what we're sharing today, you will see how we can bring in Indigenous ways of knowing and being into some of our instruction around this topic.
Hey, Helen, quick question.
Yeah. Yes.
How would you address someone that has a negative feeling towards the acknowledging the land, doing the land acknowledgements? How would you address that?
Yeah. And if it's okay, I'm going to ask a follow-up question. Is it someone that doesn't want to acknowledge the land and that they don't want to like bring in Indigenous perspectives at all? Or is that they would rather bring in Indigenous perspectives in a different way?
It's more of not wanting to acknowledge that it's actually Indigenous land.
Yeah, so I think some of the approaches that we took in the first part of this series, where we looked at primary sources, right? And we kind of pulled back the curtain on all of those various policies that really show that because of treaties and acts of Congress and all these various legislative acts and Supreme Court cases, that there's actual evidence in our primary sources that the land belonged to Native people and that treaties were in fact giving non-Native people the rights to stay on the land. I think that's where I might start, is trying. And then also I'm a super reflective and inquiry-based person. So I would also just ask maybe where they're coming from in not wanting to acknowledge that, like what's keeping them from wanting to bring that practice into their schooling.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And definitely share the link that we shared at the beginning that has a few more resources. And I think because it comes from the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, sometimes that can have a little more weight behind it coming from a government agency as well. But that's a good question. Thank you. And to get back to our culturally responsive guidance, I think we definitely want to encourage everyone to have conversations about these topics with others. And so if anyone else has questions around how they can have these conversations, please don't hesitate to put it in the chat. But towards the end of part 1 of our series, right, we showed you this same slide around being trauma informed versus trauma specific. And the intention was to highlight the fact that as teachers in the classroom, we don't necessarily need to know the specifics of the trauma that certain students or their families are working through. And we're not necessarily encouraging you to play trauma detective and determine which of your students and families have been directly impacted by the history and the legacy of boarding schools, but instead we ask you to consider your shared responsibility within the public schooling system, right? And so the last row on the left-hand side of being trauma-informed says that trauma-informed education recognizes that trauma is omnipresent and emphasizes a shared responsibility to mitigate that impact. So we're gonna take a look at what we can do more specifically as teachers in the classroom to be trauma informed. And so one part of being trauma informed as teachers is recognizing that certain topics can be re-traumatizing or can cause harm if they're not accompanied by intentional instruction, right? So as teachers, we have the opportunity to hold space and provide students with the tools to make meaning from the true history of certain topics like Native American boarding schools. And so we wanted to highlight this 2021 article by First Nation Indigenous educator Suzanne Methot. And she offers some really wonderful considerations for when we're teaching about difficult topics like the colonization of America, which would definitely include the history of boarding schools. And so she's coming from the context of Canada, where they refer to them as residential schools, but she definitely touches on this topic specifically. And she talks a lot about preparing for the emotions that can come up, right, when talking about a topic like this. And she encourages people that as teachers, it's really our space to help students make meaning from those emotions, the same way we help them make meaning from the resources that we're sharing in the classroom, the texts that we read, or any other media that we're engaging with. And so her recommendation is to use inquiry and academic discussions to process not only the information, but also some of those emotional reactions. And specifically, she recommends working outward from the self and present day. So starting with questions that are very self-reflective, and then working backward towards a more nuanced understanding of history. And she also recommends avoiding centering non-Indigenous people and their feelings, but really working more towards relationships and responsibility, which is exactly what we asked you to do in part 1, right? We made space for you all to process by giving you those prompts to think about throughout the whole time, where we asked, how does this information change the way you think about your own role, your own relationship to being an educator in the public school system? But then also we asked you to think about, how does the information change, or what do you think your responsibilities are towards Native students and families and communities, given this history as an educator, right? And the last recommendation she offers that I think is absolutely critical, and I hope that you keep this in mind as we go through the other resource recommendations for today, which is that she says we need to portray Indigenous peoples with agency. And I think that in our other series about Indigenous perspectives in social studies, we kind of talked a lot about how Native people have been misrepresented in textbooks and in history. And a lot of times they're misrepresented. They're represented in a way that's very passive, that centers a lot of the, again, trauma that's happened to Native peoples. And while it's super, super important to include that truth, we also want to make sure that we're showcasing Indigenous peoples as having agency, and also showcasing just the joy and the positive and the strengths that many Native people have and continue to have despite some of this history. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information. I appreciate the question that kind of broke it up a little bit, but I am going to pass it back over to Linda to go over some of the trauma-informed guidance that's not specific to Native American boarding schools, but we felt would be helpful for our topic today.
Yeah, so like Helen had mentioned, this is not something that's new, and it's not something that really applies just to our Indigenous students. You know, we have students from all different walks of life that are coming to us with historical trauma as well as current trauma, right? Just even from dealing with COVID and that loss of community that happened for 2 years. So it's a wide range of things we have to think about as we go forward as teachers. So we wanted to include this just to show you another example of a framework that you could follow that also has these ideas and concepts in it of just being, you know, kind of trauma informed as you go through your daily lessons. So these come from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and have been vetted and taught by teachers around the country. And there are a lot of similar kinds of themes and concepts that you see with them. And like Helen had mentioned, vocabulary matters, right? So taking the term to define things is an important concept for all of our students. Avoiding simple questions or answers to complex questions, that idea that, you know, you may not know all of the reasons why things happen. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other idea is, you know, striving for that balance, right? We want to provide narratives of people telling their own stories, their own perspectives. And I like this next one, the idea of avoiding comparisons of pain, right? It's not a pain Olympics is what I've heard a lot of people, teachers and talk about, where it's really, we don't want to compare the trauma that's happened to our kids, but we want to maybe make some connections in some of the trauma that they've had, or maybe historical trauma, that it's like, oh, well, that's similar to some of these other ideas. And that goes along with avoiding that romanticizing history, right? And Helen touched upon this, the idea that we look at Indigenous peoples in kind of a pre-1900 context, and we want to avoid romanticizing those historic myths and stereotypes, and really look at Indigenous peoples as, you know, members of our community today and part of our community, and what that does with it. And that helps us also putting that context to the history as making it relevant for our students today, right? And so a lot of these are the same. Same thing with statistics, right? And really using responsible methodological choices, looking at the historic accuracy of maybe the materials that we're going to talk about choosing, making sure it's, you know, being respectful to both victims, you know, and survivors. You know, our children are the survivors of these, you know, historical trauma that happened to their grandparents in these boarding schools. And then, you know, does that promote that kind of safe and effective learning as we go forward?
Okay, so now we're gonna take a little break from presenting and chatting and give you some time to process this information, to really think about it. I know from our Mentimeter reflections, people were saying that they're relatively new to this idea of being culturally responsive and or trauma informed. And so we want to give you some space to just connect with each other, with the other people in this room. And so we're asking you to reflect on these two questions of what culturally responsive and or trauma-informed practices have you used in your classroom? What are some of the challenges of implementing culturally responsive or trauma-informed practices? And these are just starting points. And so if there's other thoughts or reflections that are resonating with you after some of the information we just shared, please feel free to share whatever is on your mind in this space. We are asking, again, just like in part one, that you follow virtual talking circle protocol, in the sense that you let each person in the space respond and share before you have further discussions, just so that there's equitable and inclusive communication going on, and you're allowing every person to share. And so in just a moment, Linda will send you into just a few breakout rooms, and then we'll come back together and kind of debrief together. I want to say maybe 7 minutes, Linda, 6 minutes.
Yes, 6-7 minutes would be good.
Perfect. And we'll give you a 1-minute warning, and I will be sharing this screen into your breakout rooms, which is a new Zoom feature. So you should see the questions and the kind of instructions on the screen as well.
All right, we are opening all rooms. I'm going to put the chat in. Here we go, the question in the chat as well.
Helen and Linda have a question for both of you.
Mhm.
Gonna get the recording here. Again.
All right, so we're going to transition now into really exploring the different types of resources that can be used to teach and learn about Native American boarding schools. And so we're going to be organizing this next section by the type of resource. And so the first type that we want to highlight in this section is maps, for their ability specifically to connect to place. And so as I noted in the section earlier on Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous peoples have long-standing relationships with places and the non-human beings that they share those places with, including animals and plants and land and waterways. And so bringing maps as a primary source into your instruction about Native American boarding schools is a really great way to contextualize this topic by providing insights into a place at a particular time, and or by demonstrating how places and understanding of places can change over time. And so we encourage you to contextualize this topic by prioritizing the particular place in which you and your students are learning. So you might do this by exploring how Native American boarding schools influence the local area around you, before zooming out to show that boarding schools were not only a national phenomena, but actually something that happened on a global scale to many Indigenous peoples. And so the use of maps allows us to make clear connections between, as Melita just shared, between the removal of children in Indigenous communities and the process of land dispossession. And so now we want to take you through a protocol for exploring maps that you can use in your own classroom.
So this next activity that we're going to do is one of my favorites because it really works well for getting younger students that are, emerging readers really engaged in primary sources. And again, letting them do the work of historians, geographers, political scientists, and economists, and all of that as their little ones. So we're going to take you through this. These are a series of maps that we got off of the just recently released Truth Healing Commission on Native American Boarding Schools that the Department of Interior just put out, this part 1. All of these maps are available for free, and we'll include them with the PDF that comes when we send this to you after we complete your attendance. So I'm going to take you folks through this as if you were my students. So as we look at this map that you see on the screen, I just want you to type into the chat, what do you see? No analysis. You can pretend as if you're your kiddos in kindergarten, 1st or 2nd grade. Just what do you see? So take a moment and type that into the chat. Perfect. I see dots all over the place. That's exactly what a kindergartner is going to say, right? Blue dots scattered. Areas with heavy clusters, boarding school, the United States. More dots in sections than others. Good. Yep. I think that's perfect. So again, you can do this and show your students a map like this and take it through. And then you can also then prompt them with different questions like, what did you notice first? And have them answer. Or what size and shape is the map? What kind of geographical elements do you see in this map? Describing something that maybe doesn't belong on the map is a really good one to ask young folks. The places that we show, and then also too, again, to get some of those reading skills in, asking students, well, what if any words do you see on the map? And so as you do this, and as we do this as a group, that would be the first thing, is it's just a real, what do you see, right? We don't get into any analysis. So now after we do the observe, now we go to the next section, which is our reflections. So click on the next slide for me, please.
Oh, I think I did. It's on reflect.
Oh, it says observe right now on mine.
Oh, there we go. It was paused. That's why I think
There we go. All right, perfect. So now we're at the reflection piece. So now what you want your students to do is just kind of reflect on what they've seen. So as I'm asking you these questions, put it into the chat. So now we get a little bit further and deeper into our analysis of this map. So why do you think this map was made? Would be a good question to ask your students. Or who do you think was the audience? So you can start to get into, audience and who creates different types of sources. How does this map compare to current maps of the United States? What does this map tell us about the people who made it, and what doesn't it tell us? And then you can ask things if you're using like a historic map. You could ask them like, what would be different if the map was made today? And then what would be the same? So definitely you can see that there are, a lot of questions that you can use to kind of really prompt your students to analyze, well, why do you have this cluster of maps over here in the Four Corners area and over here in Oklahoma, right? Why do you have some maps over here? But then if you look at the East Coast, there's hardly any dots at all. So really getting your kids to ask some of those questions, that kind of inquiry as to, well, what problem does this create, and that sort of thing. So just really reflect on that kind of analysis as you're going through it. Then the next and final step for observe, reflect, question is to really just now question, right? What do you wonder about? So as you take your students through this, asking them, well, what do you wonder about? Who is this map telling us the story of? What is the story that it's telling us? When did the story take place? Where did the story take place? Why did this story take place, right? Especially when we're thinking in terms of kindergarten, first and second graders, right? It's all about that story, that connection to family, that connection to communities. And I didn't put it in here, but just by doing this one simple activity, you are going to hit about 14 social studies standards. And you're also going to hit about 10 ELA standards. So just by doing this small activity, you're getting and touching upon geography. You can talk about migration. You can talk about the economics, what happens when we're moving people to these boarding schools, and really see where some of the questions are that your students will take you, even though they are, just young ones in K through 2.
Yeah, and so the next kind of activity that we wanted to share that you could do and to highlight what's included in the appendix of the Federal Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report, they do have maps for each individual state, right? And so you can see here that there were 48 federal Indian boarding school sites in Arizona, which I believe was second only, maybe third to Oklahoma. And so we were going to have you all annotate the map, but I think for the sake of time, we might just move forward a little bit. But it would be great for you with your students to consider, right, where you are in relation to the map, right, puts you in relation to the topic that you're learning about, right? So where their boarding school is close to us, look at where we are now. The report does a great job of talking about the inclusion of sites, and that's not necessarily just like physical school sites. Some of them were sites where other activities were happening as well.
One way, if I can interject just real quick, to have your students annotate it. I know we're not doing the activity with you, but you can take these maps or really any primary source that's good. And if you laminate them and get some of those old school vis-a-vis markers that we used to use on overhead projectors, which I'm dating myself, that's a great way to get your students starting to annotate maps. You could also maybe just display it on a whiteboard and then have your kids take a dry erase marker and say, oh, where are we, right? And what boarding schools are around us. And so that way you get them actively engaging with it. You can also put things into pictures and maps, and in any kind of primary source, you can put it into a sheet protector if you don't have the ability to laminate something. And all of those are great things that are very low cost. I know they do have some that you can buy that are, you can get them through like Oriental Trading Company or something, but they're low cost ways that you can reuse these primary sources, and that you can just print out one copy, and then you're not having to make copies every single year, and you can just wipe things off and go again. So
Thank you. Those are great suggestions, Linda. And then the last point we want to make about maps is that, as we mentioned earlier, maps are a great way to make the connection between Native American boarding schools and the land loss experienced by tribal nations. And so on the left, that Indian land cessions graphic, it actually comes from one of the curricula that we'll be highlighting a little bit later on. But these are a great way to look at changes over time, right? And I included the little GIF up at the top just because I have shown this to students before, and just the change from the very beginning to how little land is marked at the end there is very dramatic, and students resonate with that, and it brings up a lot of curiosity around why was it so dramatic, and it happens with the time up at the top. It's a great way, again, to just look at these topics over a period of time.
So now we're going to get into some books and articles that we think do a great job of using storytelling, again, that kind of Indigenous ways of knowing and being, to, again, talk to your students about boarding schools, and also then recognizing that kind of Indigenous pedagogy that we have going forward. Another thing that when you think about the books and articles that you use in your classroom, you do want to keep kind of those trauma-informed guidelines that we recommended, both from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the ones that Helen went over, as an idea to humanize, right, those personal stories, so make them relevant to today, right? We don't always want to teach Indigenous things as being part of the past. And then centering those Indigenous voices and experiences by using books and articles that are actually written by, illustrated by Indigenous peoples themselves. Again, so you're centering on Indigenous voices. So here we have a number of primary source books as kind of just that we've noticed here. Some of them are great and are appropriate for younger children, but some of them may not be quite so appropriate for maybe the K-2 grade level, but they're still good that if you have them, if your librarian is looking for books that they want to incorporate, hey, I've got some money to add to our book collection, or if you have the ability to add to your own personal library, right? These are some good ones that we recommend that are great to cover about them. And you can look them up online and find out which ones are great to use for you. We also have a couple of things here that I'm going to put into the chat. Of the book list from Color in Colorado has a great book on Indian residential boarding schools for young adults. Again, some of those may not be really for K-2, but they're perfect that you can use. And all of these are great. And then also, in addition, you can look up the National Council for Social Studies. Every year does a notable trade books list, and they do it by topic, concept, and grade band that you can search it up. If you are a member of the National Council for Social Studies, you get the current year, but if you're not a member, you can go in and search that link that I gave you in the chat for past books that you can look at to use and really investigate, what's going on, especially talking to, like the loss that occurred with boarding schools, and really trying to bring about that balanced approach to teaching the topic, and also then looking at contemporary stories that you can use in your classrooms. Couple that aren't on here that we mentioned that are great to look at are We Are Water Protectors is a great contemporary one. In fact, I just bought that one for my 2-year-old grandson about what happened with the Lakota up in the pipeline, and it's really well done. The illustrations are just gorgeous, beautiful illustrations. And another one is Fry Bread, which we've seen is I think it won a bunch of awards, actually. I think it won a Caldecott Award. So it's another great book to bring in kind of contemporary Indigenous perspectives as well.
Yeah, and to Linda's point around bringing a balanced approach, well, you know, books like We Were Alone or Not My Girl are geared for a very young audience. We recognize that not all students are going to be developmentally ready to talk about this topic. And so thinking about how if these students were to learn about this topic later on, how can you ensure that their first representation of Native peoples isn't just the trauma, but really the joy, the humor, the resilience, the strength that Native peoples have. So even if you're not talking about boarding schools, thinking about how you can bring in other narratives that are then going to enrich the students learning about boarding schools at a later point, right? When they're a little bit older.
Yeah, it's all about that revitalizing, right? That we're forward looking, which I think someone had mentioned in the chat before, right? That about, you know, culturally maybe being in the past and we don't look at the past, but that idea of revitalization and forward looking. So when you do select primary sources to use in your classroom, right, make sure that you use a variety of primary sources and that you select those with thoughtfulness and care. So you can use maps like we've shown you. You can also use narratives and stories, and you can take those and edit them down to make them, you know, a quote or just a little piece of a story, or you can take a story and you can take the gist of that story to then retell it as well. And those are all appropriate ways to use those. And we do have here, government sites are a great place to go and start looking for primary sources with regards to like the National Archives, Library of Congress, the National Museum of the American Indian, which is one of the Smithsonian museums, is fantastic. They have a lot of exhibits online that you can access, as well as all of our local tribal nations as well. And I'm gonna hit Helen up to find the contact list for that the Office of Indian Education has gone out and put together a nice resource for you where they have taken and curated all of the 22 Indigenous tribes in Arizona and have contact lists where you can go look out, here's their website, and do that. Primary sources that allow you again to emphasize that the Native Americans boarding schools didn't just occur because of individuals, right? That we learned that from part one, that this was part of a government approach to essentially, you know, take the land away from Indigenous peoples and to take away their culture as well. And again, while you may not get into those topics with young ones, you do, like Helen said perfectly, right? You want their first approach to Indigenous peoples to be one that's positive, that's good. So when they do learn about these other things and these difficulties, they have this base and this foundation. And that's where you as a kindergarten through second grade teacher set that foundation of what Indigenous peoples are all about as you go forward in their teaching.
Sorry, I realized my screen is, did it move forward for you?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. I was pulling up the other link. But yeah, so as we said, it's also really important that we introduce primary sources with the same level of care and intentionality with which we choose them in the first place, right? So for example, we want to ask you to take a moment and engage with the two primary sources we have up on the screen here. These are newspaper kind of political cartoons, you may say. But we really want you to connect it back to what we talked about in part one and think about how do these images connect to what we learned in part one of this series. And recall that in part one, Professor Pino provided us an amazing overview of the Federal Indian Trust responsibility and relationship between Native peoples and the federal government. So when you're thinking about that relationship, how do these images possibly connect to that? Are they showing a similar kind of relationship? Are they pushing back against what we learned in part one? But we'll give you just a moment to share in the chat. And so by providing students, as you're reflecting, what we're hoping to demonstrate here is that when we provide students with the accurate history and the context surrounding Native American boarding schools, they can come to deeper and more well-informed conclusions and analyses of primary sources like this, right? So if you didn't have that context from part one, which maybe you didn't attend part one or you didn't have a chance to watch the recording, it would be interesting to see what your thoughts are around these images. But I know for myself, when we look at this one on the right that says Uncle Sam's Indian wards, it makes me think about Professor Pino talking about that guardian ward relationship between the federal government and Native peoples, and how most federal policy and legislative acts position Native peoples as wards of the government, right? Who had to be taken care of, who had to be saved by the federal government. And I think we can see a similar kind of relationship in the image on the left side, where the description says, educating the Indians, a female pupil of the government school at Carlisle visits her home at Pine Ridge Agency. And so seeing how different that student looks coming back from the schooling versus her peers who are still at home. And I do want to acknowledge the question in the chat of how you can go back and watch part one. Linda, do you mind speaking to how people can access that recording?
Yeah, so we have that recording recorded right now, and then we will be posting it after we get done with all of the second sessions that we do. We have them now through Thursday. We will be posting those online at our recorded videos for the Social Studies Standards website, and then the Office of Indian Education probably will post a link to it as well, just so we have multiple ways to access that. So we do have it recorded. I sent it out in the email, so if you pull up your reminder email, you can kind of get an early preview of the link. That's just a temporary link. We will be moving it to a more permanent place on our website. But if you pull up that email that I sent you yesterday, I believe, or no, wait, today's Monday. So I sent it on Friday. So if you pull up that email, you have that already and have access to that. And then you can, it will be permanently housed on our websites after this week. And then you can go anytime and look at it and rewatch it. And you can also pull up the video, the viewing guide that's on there as well. So.
Thank you, Linda. And I'm going to pass it over to you for the rest of the primary source kind of websites that we want to highlight.
Yeah, so right here, I wanted to show you a couple of things with the Library of Congress. I'm going to put the links in the chat, and let's see what's here. Let me get
I can drop
there.
Oh, you got them.
Actually, you know what, Helen, I might have you pull up the first one just to kind of show you where teachers can go and get this kind of information. So the Library of Congress has done a fantastic job of, first of all, this is just curating some classroom sets of materials. So it's pictures that you can choose, narratives, a whole collection of sources that you can go through. They have a teacher guide for you in preparation for it, and talking about the lesson procedure. All of that for you is already curated in there. And then this section here, let's see. So yeah, so you can go through, it's in this case, you can see the resources. It's got the pictures of Jim Thorpe. It had, let's see, the founder, superintendent. So each one of these are resources here that you can click on, print out, display, and show your students in there for this procedure. And it goes through the different examples of what you can and can't do, or not can and can't do, but what you should do for the lesson plan. And so it kind of takes you through that. The second link on there, if you can pull up the document analysis tool. So this is a fantastic tool through the Library of Congress. And this is the observe, reflect, question activity that we did earlier with a map. So they have created analysis tools that you can use to guide your students through any kind of primary source, whether it's a chart, whether it's a manuscript, an oral history, right? To kind of continue with some of those indigenous ways of knowing and being, newspapers if you use, photographs and prints, political cartoons. So this is just an excellent tool that you can use to obviously, since we're dealing with kindergartners through second graders, this would be you guiding them through any kind of primary resource source that you would use in your classroom. And so that's what we'd like you to do. We also have here the, let me see here. I think I put these in the chat. Oh no, that's the National Archives one. So this is hyperlinked. So the Digital Public Library of America is also a great place where you can go to find primary resources on American Indian boarding schools. And then same thing with the National Archives. Again, these are some of these government sponsored websites that you can go to. And so you can click here and it's got a whole lesson talking about before and after, but you can see all the different primary sources that they offer you. So you can take just one or two, or maybe you address one in, you know, the K-2 grade band when you're talking about community or schools, right? Then maybe the 3-5 teachers can get a little bit more in depth with it. And then the 6-8 teachers get even more in depth with it. That's kind of that idea there. The National Archives also is a fantastic place to go and really look at the different things that they have. They have presidential libraries. So if you want to look up yourself and find and educate yourself, there's lots of places to go to find primary resources that hit on sense of community and Indigenous peoples and things like that. And then the next are these document analysis worksheets. So if you click, and Helen, if I can have you open those, I want to show you these because these are also from, like the Library of Congress one, but a couple of things why I like these a little bit better is that they have them in 2 different reading levels. So if you ever switch to maybe a higher reading level, you can talk about the, you know, a sound recording, you can get those, and you can look at analyzing a photograph for a younger kid. And it's definitely geared for those early readers, emerging readers, primary, you know, primary grades. And then they have the same, and it's the same idea of observe, which is the meet the photo, reflect, observe its parts, and then try to make sense of it is kind of that question, what do you have going forward? So I like these a little bit better, one, because they kind of separate it out and make it a little bit more user-friendly for your students. And if you go back, they do have all of these in Spanish as well. So if you teach in a dual language immersion classroom, or maybe you have some students that Spanish is their first language, by all means, print that out and give that to your students in Spanish. And that's really nice to be able to offer that help for your students too. And now I'm going to turn it back to Helen.
Yeah, we just wanted to highlight an additional place where you can find primary sources. You know, and Linda could speak to this even more than myself, but the way our social studies standards here in Arizona, we really encourage teachers to use primary sources. And I just wanted to highlight the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center because they have not only images and publications, but also lists and ledgers, teaching resources, student records, cemetery information, and additional resources. Again, although learning about boarding school cemeteries and unmarked burial sites is not necessarily appropriate for young students, it is part of the motivation for the federal investigative report was the discovery of mass unmarked burial sites in Canada at some of the residential schools. And so that is going to be a really relevant and timely theme for some of our older students. And we share it with you just because we know teachers talk, we know you share resources with each other. So you may have some colleagues who teach older students who may find some of those resources helpful. But one last opportunity with primary sources we want to highlight is the use of quotes. And so I'll pass it over to Linda.
Yeah, so these are just a couple of quotes that you could use, for example, to ask your children, you know, as you talk about it, like, what did they think? What did they see? Some of these you might need to obviously reword to get the gist for your students. But again, the idea that primary sources isn't just maps, it isn't just pictures, right? It can be quotes, and you can use something just as a simple quote about, you know, from an Indigenous person that experienced the Native American boarding schools. Like the two pictures that Helen showed before, you can have kids identify, even young students can identify, well, what's different and what's similar, right, about these. And our standards, like Helen said, really do ask students to be the historian, be the geographer, be the economist, and make those decisions. And you do that through inquiry and primary sources. So those are just a couple of examples that we found that we wanted to share with you.
And lastly, of course, we want to bring it back to the federal investigative report, because that report includes briefs on all 408 identified federal Indian boarding schools. And we've shared the report that includes the helpful narrative section, which guided a lot of what Professor Pino shared in part 1, and also the maps that we showed earlier today. And in this slide, I chose this specific example from Wide Ruins boarding school in Arizona, because at the end there's general notes, and you'll notice that the end of this note says the school currently operates as Wide Ruins Community School, a tribally controlled school under the Navajo Nation. And so I wanted to highlight the concept of tribally controlled schools as a great way, again, to represent Indigenous peoples with agency, to share some of the current contemporary efforts that tribal nations are using to heal and move forward from the boarding school movement. Is the idea that a lot of these schools are tribally controlled now, and tribes get to exercise their sovereignty to provide culturally sustaining and revitalizing education now for their citizens and their communities.
So we're going to go through these a little bit faster just because we don't have as much time left with you guys. But really, media literacy is another great way to talk about the Native American boarding schools, because we want our kids to be both responsible consumers and producers of content. And so this is the idea that we want students to read laterally rather than reading all the way down. And this will be hyperlinked when you get this after we check your attendance. But even for young kiddos, right, we can very much get them used to that idea, that pedagogy, that who made this message? What techniques are they using for this message? Why did they make this message? And then also, as they produce things, what am I authoring? What message am I trying to get across? And just those beginning foundation ideas that how you communicate, and what you consume is very important in perpetuating some harmful and not culturally sustaining kind of practices. So by being cognizant of these things in media literacy, even as young kids, what they watch is important, which we're going to get into videos next.
Yeah, so using multimedia resources like videos or podcasts are a great way to promote those media literacy skills that Linda just shared. And again, these are ways that you can start to incorporate oral traditions and just having that more balanced approach to learning through listening and observing. And then lastly, using videos and podcasts made by or with Native peoples are a great way to bring in additional Indigenous voices into your lessons if you're unable to physically bring in community members into your space, right? And so a video resource that is appropriate specifically for K-2 students that I really love and I've used with young students is the PBS show Molly of Denali. And if you're not familiar, it's set in a rural Alaskan Native village, and it features an Alaskan Native lead character, Molly. It's specifically created for children ages 4 to 8 to showcase the ways that children can actually access and create informational text broadly, media might be a more accurate word, in their daily lives, right? But at the same time, the stories are infused with Alaskan Native values. They even have this great handout that kind of explains some of the values that are showcased in the film or in the show, traditions, language, as well as contemporary life. And the reason we're showing it to you is because they have a particular episode called Grandpa's Drum that touches on the impact of Native American boarding schools, while also highlighting how a lot of communities, a lot of young people, specifically young Native people, are revitalizing family engagement, and we recognize that
Okay, I'm going to pause.
yeah, so we just wanted to highlight that there's a lot of resources that come along with, and the episodes include lesson plans that you can use in your classroom beyond just this topic. Again, a way to show positive Native representations of contemporary life. And so, Linda, it's
Yeah, so with that, again, we don't expect you to rewrite your entire scope and sequence, knowing that, you have a lot on the plate. And especially as elementary teachers, right, you're having to be, masters of all trades, of all content areas. So we ask that just you keep in mind that you prioritize resources that were created by Indigenous peoples and by Indigenous organizations. We ask that you also take the time to review the lessons yourself before you actually use them in the classroom, because sometimes, a book may look really good on the cover. Then when you start reading into it, it's like, oh, the theme of this book is not very well done. And so that may be, something that wouldn't be appropriate to use with your students. And again, we also recognize that your students best. That's one of the great things about being a local control state, right? Is that you can really hit upon those kinds of ideas and themes that really are what your students need, rather than maybe having some state mandated kind of curriculum. So we encourage you to just do what works best for your kids. Again, there are lessons out there that are already vetted and done that are terrific that you can use with your students. This is one from PBS has got a great one for Native American boarding schools as a starter. So again, this will be hyperlinked that you can use this with your kids. It's got discussion questions in there, and the resource, encourages you to relate to those and to the traditions and cultures of your own kids. And we know that creating in the standards, right, we have to talk about culture and community and the school community. And so this would be one way in which you can do that, and then bring in some of that Indigenous voices and perspectives with regards to the boarding school. Again, setting that foundation for students to then examine maybe the more difficult aspects of boarding schools when they get older and when it is age appropriate.
We also want to highlight some locally created resources that can come out of the program, the Diné Institute for Navajo Nation Educators, which is located at NAU. This particular lesson is geared towards fourth grade students, again, so a little bit older, but you can definitely take elements of it and use it in your own classroom. And we definitely want to highlight it specifically because it brings a really unique approach to teaching about boarding schools. It is encouraging students to make connections across the experiences of Native Americans at boarding schools and then Japanese Americans at internment camps. And this particular lesson uses place and multiple perspectives to bring together these two historical events, as the old Loop boarding school later housed a Japanese internment camp. So both of these experiences are grounded in that particular place. And I just really appreciate these lesson plans. There's a number of them. There's dozens of them on their website, which Linda just put in the chat. And we recommend exploring the other lesson plans that they do have ones even for early education that are a great way to bring these topics into your classroom. And then lastly, we'd like to highlight the Truth and Healing curriculum from the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. This is an incredibly comprehensive curriculum that is asset-based, and it comes in elementary, middle, and high school options. And the curriculum includes 4 main lessons on history, impacts, story, and healing. And then each lesson within that includes an into, through, and beyond sequence that really gives students the opportunity to learn through inquiry and then through exploration, and then encourages them to take their learning deeper through learning extensions through that beyond section, right? And the lessons include wonderful multimedia resources. They emphasize representing Native peoples, nations, and their stories with agency, respect, and authenticity. And in particular, we wanted to highlight how at all three levels, they include great definitions of words that we know aren't necessarily easy to find student-friendly definitions of, right? And so we encourage you to look at this free resource. It's available for everyone. And another interesting connection that they make is that they make this connection between boarding schools and pandemics. And so I think the curriculum does a great job of bringing it into a contemporary context. And again, bringing in that strengths-based, what are communities and families and nations doing to heal and really move forward while acknowledging the truth of the boarding schools, which we know is so important.
All right, so we're going to go very quickly through the standards again, just to show you how many standards and how this learning applies to our already appropriate standards that have been adopted and approved. So just real quick in the chat, I'd like for you to just type in a number of how many standards do you think would be addressed by doing a lesson or two, or including Indigenous voices, specifically Native American boarding schools in your classroom. So just take a guess, type a number into the chat. And so we've got 15, 13, 15.
You gave them a bit of a hint earlier, Linda.
I did kind of blow the lead there on that one. 10, 15. Yeah, I totally did. 12 to 15. Perfect. All right, so let's just quickly show you some of the applicable standards. So these are obviously not all of the social studies standards, but in our kindergarten standards, right, the course considerations, we ask teachers to cover things like culture in the home, school, and community. So this would be a great place in which you could, as a topic, cover these standards. And then from a kindergarten standards, we've got some of the disciplinary skills and processes. That's those SP coded ones. You've got civic standards when we talk about fairness and respect, when we talk about schools and communities, right? The G would be geography. So that perfect example of that observe, reflect, and question standard. And then when we talk about history standards, when we talk about our own cultures and compare that to the culture of others, this is a great way to, again, make this relevant to today. And while you may not be talking about the trauma of the past with kids because it's not developmentally appropriate, you are identifying and recognizing that their culture is important, that who they are a part of today is one to be recognized, as well as this is one that we talked about in our other training, right? When we talk about American symbols and talk about Indigenous flags and Indigenous symbols that can be used as American symbols today. And again, give them that kind of agency, right? That they are a part of American culture, I think is really huge, so that they get that one buy-in. You recognize and affirm that this is important to learn. And then when they do talk about some of those more difficult topics later on, they know that they are in that community of love and respect and welcome, right? So then it makes it a little bit easier for them to acknowledge that there is this historic trauma that happened to their families and their communities in the past. So then when we look at first grade, you have to understand perspectives of others. That's just right up, right there, looking at human movement. When we talk about human migration, right? Using that same boarding school activity with a first grade class would be fantastic, or just maybe you want to narrow in on just Arizona would be good. Again, the disciplinary skills and processes, looking at those kinds of inquiry-based cause and effect, comparing diverse cultures using photographs, civic standards, geography standards, and history standards as well. And then in second grade, same thing, development and change of civilizations and cultures. So this would be great to look at boarding school kids and how they to the past, when they went to boarding schools, and then look at maybe Indigenous pictures of students today, right? To bring that in and make that relevant. Looking at societal institutions and their belief systems, again, affirming some of those Indigenous ways of knowing and being would be a great way to bring that in. Some of those oral traditions, oral belief systems. If you live near a community where maybe you have certain, holidays. I know just recently, like especially with spring and summer, you have certain holidays that are okay to share in tribal communities. And then there are certain holidays maybe that are not okay to share, because that's something that is privately held within the community, and that's okay. And you can just acknowledge it. But then here again, in second grade, we can get even more in depth with some of these concepts with inquiry, also with civics, but also maybe some of the economics of it as well, right? With the geography and history. So lots to go over that we can cover in our classes.
Yeah, and we hope that these are just a great starting point for you to consider how you can start to bring this topic into your classroom. And to some of the questions we got earlier, using the standards to your advantage, that you're teaching the standards, when you bring in these topics, and you're affirming your students' backgrounds or the communities around you, making sure that they feel included. So we now want to give you a little bit of time to start talking about how you're planning to use some of the resources, some of what we learned together today. And so Linda just shared in the chat a link to a resource collection. So every resource we talked about today, and if there's any that we didn't get, we will include them, is included in this collection of resources, and they all have images so you can easily find them. But we're also asking you to, in your breakout rooms, just document a few of the takeaways that you have from your conversation, maybe some examples of maybe lessons that you might start to integrate, or units or topics you already have in your classroom where this topic could be brought in to enrich it and supplement that. And then also how you might apply some of maybe the strategies or the protocols that we shared with you all today as well. So we will take about 8 minutes. Does that sound good, Linda?
Yeah, I think so. I think we've made up time where we could take probably the whole 10 to do it too.
Okay, and so we're really just asking, what are you taking away from our time together today? How are you going to apply it into your instructional design? And then what connections are you making to your specific context and classroom? So we'll send you into your breakout rooms. You should be with the same people. If you got kicked out at all, you can always ask us and we can send you into a specific room.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms. We're going to pause the recording. There we go.
Okay, so thank you everyone for taking some time to just, reflect on everything that we talked about today, start to make meaning from it and think about what does this mean for your classroom and the students you work with. We were just saying that in the planning slide deck, I saw people sharing that, the idea of using books authored by Indigenous peoples was resonating with you. And I do want to share that the Office of Indian Education has another professional learning opportunity happening in the fall around using Indigenous literature to promote literacy. And that's going to be an in-person event. However, if you are an educator teaching on tribal lands, we are offering travel stipends on a first come, first serve kind of basis. And so if you're interested in attending that professional learning, everybody that comes will actually walk away with books for their classroom that are authored by Indigenous peoples. But it definitely makes sense that our K-2 educators are resonating with the idea of using trade books and images to connect this topic with their students.
Do you have a date for that?
Yeah, it's actually going to be on Indigenous Peoples Day. So it's going to be on October 10th. And we're just now finalizing that. And it's going to be at ASU's campus at the Labriola American Indian National Data Center. And they have a huge collection of books that we'll get to kind of explore together and look at on that day. And they'll be co-presenting some information, which is going to be really great. But we have a save the date that should be out next week. So we will follow up with everybody.
That'll be fantastic.
So in closing, we just want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're just going to wrap up our time in these last few minutes. If you'd like to share, I think just in the chat would be appropriate, kind of what you're taking away from today, maybe what questions you still have so that we can consider how we can keep supporting you if you want to teach about this topic. We won't go into the Menti just for the sake of time. So if you have any questions that are still on your mind or really some aha moments you'd like to share, please put those in the chat. And I will turn it over to Linda to just kind of talk about next steps and making sure you all get your attendance credit for this.
Correct. So next steps, we do have a survey that Helen will put into the chat here real quick for you to complete to help us make sure that we are providing the most efficient and effective professional learning for you all, because that's what we do. We teach teachers now. And so we want to make sure that we are meeting your needs. So how this works, so please complete the survey. To make sure that you get full attendance, please type your first and last name into the chat. I will be saving the chat and including that in with the PDF that I send out to you so that you have another resource with all the links and discussion questions that we talked about. So first and last name, please, into the chat, and then you will receive an email from me. That email from me will be your note that your attendance is marked complete. Right now, it will show that you attended, but it won't show that it's completed. And so once you get that email from me with the PDF of the presentation and the chat, then you'll know that you can get back into the ADE Connect system, get into the event management system, and that's how you can print out your certificate. And the nice thing is it stores them all there for you. So if ever you lose them, you can always get back in and reprint them out for you. And then we did want to make you aware that we will be coming out shortly with information on what we're calling our communities of practice. And these are essentially 1 hour, 1.5 hour virtual get-togethers where we will come together as educators from across the state to really kind of gauge how you've been able to incorporate some of these Indigenous ways of knowing and being, Indigenous voices, resources from Native American boarding schools, right? How do we get those into our classrooms? What successes have you had? What challenges that you've had, maybe what barriers, and really kind of come together once a quarter as elementary teachers to discuss how we can do this better and how we can help one another going forward. And also ways in which Helen and I can mirror some of those Indigenous ways of knowing and being to help you as you go through this in your classrooms as well. And so, oh, go ahead, Helen.
I was just going to say, I noticed that someone in the chat must be a school leader because they said they're excited to share this with their staff and their teachers. And we also want to note that we are all available, Linda, myself, Molita, to bring this professional learning to your school as well for no charge, as the Arizona Department of Education and our partner organization, the Administration for Native Americans and Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center. We are available to come out and provide this learning for your entire staff if you felt this was meaningful and something, and we can kind of tailor it a little bit more to your context, right? And where you're at and what your needs are. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Sorry, Linda, I just wanted to, I noticed there was a
thank
leader
you for
here.
bringing that up. So there's all of our contact information, and I'm going to stop the recording now and just thank you all so much for sharing with us today and being a part of this learning opportunity that we had. So there we'll